welcome everybody to our March professional lecture for the Bowen Center. It's an honor to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, Lauren Errington. All right, so Lauren Errington is the Executive Director of the Family Systems Institute in Sydney, Australia. She has a master's in couple and family therapy and is an accredited mental health social worker and clinical family therapist at the Family Systems practice in Sydney. As part of her ongoing interest in the application of Bowen Theory to clinical practice, Lauren has published several articles in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy, and she was a co-editor for the June 2024 special issue of the ANZJFT on Bowen Family Systems Theory. I have a copy. They're wonderful articles, and I would definitely recommend purchasing one if you're interested in that. But yeah, Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you. And
great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to just sort out my slides and make sure I can share my screen to get underway. Okay, excellent. Yeah, it's particularly nice for me that it is the morning in Australia, and that it's normally I'm joining activities at the Bowen Center at some ungodly hour, in very early morning. So it's really nice to be with you in this way, and thank you all for being here in your evening. And I know there are some folks from Australia kind of in the group as well today. So I would actually like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I am presenting from this morning, which is in the inner west in Sydney, Australia. And this is land that belongs to the Aboriginal Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So what I'm hoping to do in this presentation today is to share some of my thinking about my ongoing effort to have Bowen Theory inform my clinical practice as a mental health clinician and as a family therapist. And specifically what I'm going to do is to share one approach that I've been playing around with in the last few years, which is to create the opportunity in clinical sessions to promote family members' observations of themselves using what I'm going to talk about as sequences and tracking relationship interactions. So what I'm going to do is start by briefly sharing some thinking about emotional stimuli in relationships, what stirs people up and what people get reactive to, before talking about the idea of sequences and their context in the broader field of family therapy, where that comes from, and then finish with some examples of using sequences in clinical practice as a way to work collaboratively with clients and try and observe the emotional process in relationships. So to begin, I'm going to start with one of the areas of interest to me in the last little while, which is to think about the natural world and the stimuli that drives creatures to move and act and interact as they need to navigate the challenges or the things before them. And to do this, what I'm going to do is draw on the work of a man called Professor Ashley Ward. He works here down the road from me at the University of Sydney, and he's a biologist there, and he's particularly interested in sensory ecology. And amongst other things, he describes his work as, and this is his description, examining which stimuli guide the behaviours of creatures, from insects to whales, and how each experiences its own domain. So some examples of the sorts of things that he gets interested in is how natural creatures and even plants navigate by what we would describe as senses, and how they use these to communicate and to protect themselves. So for example, here we have the mantis shrimp. So the mantis shrimp sees by polarized light, and this is a type of light, for example, that is mostly invisible to the human eye. But apparently the mantis shrimp use these to communicate and also to navigate and find their way around as well. And when Professor Ward is talking about hearing, he's talking about sound vibration largely. And he uses this really fascinating example of the rock cress plant, who sense the vibrations made by caterpillars who are munching on leaves close by. And with just a little bit of warning, what these plants do is they bolster their defenses and they synthesize chemicals that taste disgusting to the caterpillars, and they pack their leaves with them to deter the caterpillars and turn them away. And later on, he goes on to talk about the roundworm, and he talks about how the roundworm, who doesn't have physical contact with other worms, actually grows more slowly than others and fails to respond, to learn how to respond to danger. So in his most recent book about senses, Professor Ward describes how it's most likely that humans have in the realm of something like 167 senses, rather than the primary 5 that we just think about and often think about. And so I think just even trying to take a lens on this, getting a bigger picture on it, that there is a lot that is happening out of our awareness, and that there are only particular things that the brain is able to pay attention to and bring into awareness. And this is his description of this. He says, with so much information flowing in, demanding immediate attention, how does the brain manage to keep up with it all? And the answer is that it doesn't. It filters and winnows the information in its perpetual quest for what's important. It's especially attentive to novelty and change, and most of the sensory information that we constantly gather never makes it past the periphery of our attention into consciousness. And he goes on to say, though our senses evolved to provide intel for us, their importance is far greater than the mere data that input. And he says they profoundly shape how we think and feel about the world. And that gets me thinking that, of course, how we think and feel about the world in turn shapes the sort of intel that we pay attention to and the things that come into our awareness and that we get sensitive to as well. Now, there's a strong similarity here, I think, between the sensory intel that Professor Ward is talking about and what in Bowen Theory is talked about as the emotional stimuli that drives the emotional system. And this is what Dr. Bowen said about this in family therapy and clinical practice. He says there is one major secret. An emotional system responds to emotional stimuli. Both the stimulus and the response operate more out of awareness than in awareness. There are hundreds and perhaps thousands of these stimuli in any intense emotional interdependence. So as humans, we're really reliant on the emotional system, which in the theory is talked about as driving the life process of all living things. We're reliant on this working largely outside of our consciousness because we couldn't possibly process it all cognitively. And our senses play a really huge part in how we engage with the world. And we're also really dependent on them helping us navigate and move our way through the world. And for that to happen largely out of our awareness as well. But they also shape what we pay attention to and what we don't as well. And this is Bowen again. He says the emotional system operates through all 5 senses and more often through visual and auditory stimuli. In addition, he says there is a 6th sense that can include extrasensory perception. That's interesting, isn't it? All living things learn to process this data very early and to use it in relation to others. And he goes on to say that we have a lot more in common with what he describes as the lower forms of life, other creatures, and the natural systems that are occurring there that we might like to believe or kind of think about ourselves. And he says here, the more a life is governed by the emotional system, the more it follows the course of all instinctual behavior in spite of intellectualized explanations to the contrary. So he goes on to say that, you know, one of the things that humans do have that is different and sets us apart from other protoplasmic life is the ability to observe and to think and to abstract and to see the natural order, to kind of understand that and make sense of that, and to govern ourselves and do things a little bit differently as well, to make choices about that. And so this is the bit that I get really interested in clinically. What does it actually take for people to do this, to be able to observe themselves in interactions and the stimuli that stirs each other up? And further, to see these processes occurring in their relationships and actually think about what is important to them, and then to decide to do something differently as well. And then what is the clinician's role in this as well? So one of the ways I experiment with these ideas about emotional stimuli and what we pay attention to is that in our programs and sometimes in the mental health teams that I supervise, I use a clip from a movie and switch off the sound to reduce the audio stimuli and just get people to observe the movement and the stimuli that is kind of coming at each other in these interactions between the characters. There's a lot to observe in the subtle gestures that can be seen that stir each other up and the reactions that go back and forth. So I'm going to do that now just for a minute, just share a clip from a film. Some of you may have seen this. This is a movie called Marriage Story. I'm going to turn the sound off and we're just going to watch what happens in a minute. Just notice the gestures and think about the kind of visual stimuli that is coming at each of these characters in the interaction. Going to pause that one there. What I will often do is then flip it. I'm just finding my next slide so I don't play random YouTube videos. Here we go. What I'll often do is then also flip it and get people to close their eyes or just look down or blank out the screen to listen to the segment and try and isolate the audio sensors as well. And I think this is interesting because it's very easy to get caught up in the content when we do that bit, but the range of stimuli with sound is really interesting as well. So pace and tone and volume, repetition of things or silences. Doing this is one of the things it does is help illuminate how much we're processing automatically, but mostly out of awareness, I think. And I think it can help to begin to pay attention to the effect this has in the relationship as well. And as Bowen talks about the hundreds and thousands of stimuli that are kind of being stirred up and put out in these intense interactions. Now, to unpack this a little bit more, what I've done is I've gone back to some of the examples in family therapy and clinical practice, just to think about some of the descriptions of what happens in relationship interactions and to map it out a bit. So particularly looking in those pages there, 228 and 250, for those who are interested. So beginning with this kind of base idea that an emotional system responds to emotional stimuli and that the stimulus and the response operate more out of awareness than in awareness. They are an intimate part of an automatic relationship system and they profoundly affect the relationship. And then what happens is that there's a variation to what happens in the relationship and how things are reacted to, depending on how intense the relationship is. And so on the one hand, what you get is responses are more numerous, more intense, and more life-inducing in people with intense emotional fusions. And then at the other end, you get, but less so, probably in how numerous they are or how intense they are in people with better levels of differentiation. So this is where we start to see this variation around the intensity of the relationship and the levels of differentiation of individuals and in the system too. So part of the effort that comes out of this is to begin to observe what's actually happening in the reactivity. The goal is to define the stimulus response system in a step-by-step sequence to help gain some control over it. So these are direct quotes from the descriptions. And that special attention goes to defining the system of automatic emotional responses that operate largely out of awareness. So this is the bit that gets me really curious because I get interested in, you know, what might have been the process of defining the stimulus response system in this way or in sessions, you know, to be able to observe the chain reaction of responses and behaviors and to define a step-by-step sequence. So I have my own ideas about how I do this and where I've kind of taken this thinking, but it's such an interesting description, I think, here of what's being paid attention to. Goes on, the emotional system operates through all 5 senses and more often through visual and auditory stimuli. And listed here, things like mannerisms, gestures, facial expressions, tones of voice. So the stimulus response system is stirred up by the senses and reacted to as part of this to and fro in the relationship. And while there's a really huge range of senses operating, Bowen really emphasizes that for people, largely what we're filtering is through our visual and auditory kind of senses, and that's what the stimuli that we're mostly responsive to. And this is interesting because Ashley Ward, who I mentioned at the beginning, talks about that vision really dominates our other senses. He says we have about 200 million cells that are devoted to sight sensory receptors. And that also our hearing comprises of a network of millions of interacting neurons in that auditory cortex. And that part of the brain is interpreting and segregating these things so that we can focus on the things that are most relevant to us or most pertinent to our situation. So just interesting to think about how dominant those senses are and what we get sensitive to. So some of the visual and auditory stimuli that pop up in relationships are here: the mannerisms, gestures, facial expressions, tones of voice. And it's talked about as these can sometimes be minor emotional stimuli in one that trigger major emotional responses in the other. And this is where we get a breakdown or a kind of description of the variation again as well. And there's a difference between the intensity of the relationship, but also the amount of stimuli as well as the ability to engage or not the intellectual system as part of a way to think about this or pay attention to things. So on the one hand, what you get is when the emotional center is flooded by stimuli, there's little intellectual functioning that's not governed by the emotional center. And at the other end of that, we get when in periods of calm, when the emotional center is receiving fewer stimuli from its sensing network, the intellectual center is more free to function autonomously. We're just more able to access our thinking and kind of switch that on at that point. So I think that seeing this variation in response to the emotional stimuli is helpful for me because there are different things being observed that I get thinking about. So one seems to be the amount of stimuli in the sensory exposure. So from being flooded by a lot of it down to there just being less stimuli as well, less kind of coming at you. And the other variation that accompanies this is the level of integration. And so we'll think the level of differentiation of self. When the emotional center is in overdrive, it's very difficult to access the intellectual system through to the other end of the spectrum where the thinking system is freed up and creates the capacity to make a choice about how to respond and to do something differently. So this bit is interesting to me clinically, of course, as well, because I think some of this just really connects with the literature and the work in the realm of emotion regulation. So Michael Kerr describes the capacity to self-regulate as being embodied in the concept of differentiation of self. And that the more people can distinguish between the functioning of the two systems, the kind of thinking and feeling systems, the emotional system, the more choice they have about acting on the feeling or the thought when that is important to do so. And I think the capacity to regulate is an important part of managing self when our emotional system is flooded, either by the amount or the intensity of the stimuli that's coming at us in these interactions. So, and I also think the bit that's unique to Bowen theory in thinking about emotion regulation is thinking about how intense the relationship emotional system is and how much of this is happening out of awareness and that we're getting stimulated by and what we're sensitive to. And just how automatic this is as the individual and system tries to organize itself and kind of work out what's happening in the moment. So I think the effort to be able to zoom out and to see ourselves as part of these things and in these interactions is an important part of the effort towards emotion regulation. And I think that's essential to the work of differentiation of self, which can only happen in relationships. So the emotion regulation is not just happening over there and I'm calming myself down and detaching, but it's actually regulating in order to stay connected to other people in relationships. So next, there's a couple of things that it kind of shift into what it looks like, I think, to pay attention to these things and to be observers about the stimulus response processes. So the goal in working with spouses is to isolate and define several of the more prominent stimulus response mechanisms and to teach the spouses to be observers. And just the last one that, another one that kind of ties to that, it's not on there. A goal in therapy is to be aware of such mechanisms to define them in as much detail as possible, and to help the spouses become better observers, again, in an effort to define more and more of them. And so I think this effort really requires the engagement of the intellectual system. And for me, as I think about what it is that I'm kind of doing in clinical practice, I really think about that this is one of the things that the clinical space can offer people, that it is an opportunity to do this sort of thinking with clients, because it offers contact with a neutral person outside of their relationship system, and a calm enough space to access their thinking, and to kind of zoom out enough to make some observations. And so just these descriptions, defining more and more of these kind of, what's the stimulus response mechanisms and what's happening here. There is a really fine attention to detail. And the point is for people to be able to see this for themselves and observe the way they react and think about what they're reacting to, so that they can work out for themselves what's working and what isn't, and over time have some more control over how they respond. Which leaves us with this last bit here. Knowledge that the mechanism exists gives them some control, and any additional conscious control over the reactiveness may add up to enough emotional control to facilitate a step toward differentiation. So it's interesting to me that this effort is described as a step toward differentiation. It seems that when someone's able to separate and define their emotional and feeling and thinking systems and manage their reactivity just a little bit more, to make a choice about how to respond in an interaction rather than operating on the automatic, it is about that effort to be able to think and act for self and stay in contact with people in the relationship. So that's got me interested kind of in that description there. Now, alongside these descriptions is the importance of getting really clear about what is the role of the therapist or the coach when working with clients. And so I think the goal is to define the stimulus response system in this step-by-step sort of sequence to help clients gain some control over it. And a really important part of this is what a coach can do here to facilitate a space to free up this thinking and help people do this work of self-observation, maybe provide a structure of how to do it, but need to work on their own being calm and thoughtful and not getting in the way of that process happening as well. In fact, as it's talked about here, to stay out of it as much as possible. So these are the descriptions about the coach's role accompanying those descriptions from the previous slide. So the therapist's goal is to focus on the chain reaction between the two spouses, or on the process or on the flow of events between spouses, and to keep self out of the flow. The goal is to back up emotionally to the point where the spouses are sufficiently distant to watch the ebb and flow of the emotional process between them, while always thinking family systems. And it is essential that he focus on process, this is the coach, and that he defocus the content of what is being said. So I'll talk a little bit about this later, but it's clear that the effort for the clinician is always to be working on themselves and managing themselves as part of this process. And it raises really good questions for me about how do I keep my own thinking intact in this process? How do I keep the whole emotional family system in mind? How do I keep paying attention to process and not get caught up in content along the way too? One of the things that I also think about is that to draw on the research and the kind of broader fields of psychotherapy that really talk about that promoting the agency of clients and having the client in the expert position is really essential for people's kind of recovery. And it's easier said than done in practice, I think, sometimes, but the principle is that the more agency that people have in this process, so coming to their own conclusions, defining their own dilemmas, and solving their own problems and taking control of that, the better the longer term outcomes for people as well. And I think a really big part of this is for clients to have the opportunity to observe themselves and take up this work of change for themselves. And that a really essential part of that in we would say the therapeutic process in family therapy is for the therapist to stay out of that process and get out of it emotionally. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and just talk about the concept and use of sequences from a family therapy perspective before talking about how I use this clinically and try and do that from a Bowen family systems theory informed approach. So I was originally trained in post-Milan family therapy and introduced to a range of other models in my postgraduate training. And the idea of tracking a relationship interaction closely is not unique to any one of these theories. And it really accompanies the emergence of a lot of the systemic and strategic therapies in the mid-1970s and 80s. And tracking sequences of interactions between family members was frequently featured as either part of the assessment or intervention in a lot of these different family therapy approaches. So the idea that families are patterned is the feature that shows up across a lot of different models, with descriptions of these patterns showing up, in different ways. Things like feedback loops, homeostatic cycles, recursiveness, reciprocity, problem-maintaining behavior, sequences, systems of interaction, and morphostatic and morphogenic processes. But these two, Brunelin and Schwartz, they go so far as to say that actually the use of sequences or these ideas is the common denominator between family therapy models. And that the idea at its core is about defining patterns in the relationship by locating the problem, as I say, in time and space, and describing what is happening before, during, and after a problem occurs. So across the literature, it is the cyclical nature of a sequence or pattern that becomes a really important feature, that families repeat time and again the same interactional patterns. So when thinking about a sequence around a problem, for example, it's tracked in such a way as to complete or exhaust the completion of a round of interaction around that problem. So the idea is you track it from the period of calm to when it kind of heats up and around the problem, and you track it right through until it kind of calms down again, with the idea being that it could then kick off again from where you leave off in that cycle. So if you think about, for example, a couple in conflict, tracking the conflict between them would take one particular recent example of the conflict, gather information about what was happening before the conflict kind of kicked off, through the conflict, and right through until the conflict ended. And usually in this sort of case, it's when it fizzles out or someone leaves or it's just not talked about again, and kind of calms down until it kind of kicks off again. So that such patterns repeat themselves in relationships is part of what is drawn attention to in different family therapy models. And the impetus in a lot of these models is to interrupt the cycles and to do something differently. And that becomes an important part of the course of the therapy too. Which leads to two important points of difference for me from these other approaches, as I've been, increasingly over the years thinking about being informed by Bowen theory in my clinical practice. So one is the question about who is the information for, and who is actually responsible for change. And I also think that an emphasis on trying to observe emotional process is a unique spin on kind of thinking about these interactions and sequences too. So firstly, this idea about who is the information for and who is responsible for change. So firstly, to notice that sequences have functioned as a source of data, like information about family interactions, and mostly that data or that information is for the therapist. So particularly in structural or strategic and post-Milan models, this is the case, as well as other models as well. And a unifying ingredient in structural and strategic approaches is the therapist's role is overt in their description or prescription of the problem, and also being instructive in changing the sequence pattern. So Minuchin, for example, in structural family therapy, saw the therapist's role as breaking the symptomatic cycle in order to throw the system into disequilibrium and to change it dramatically enough that the original sequence couldn't occur. So to really mix things up so that the original sequence just had no place or opportunity to kind of occur. And part of that was about restructuring the hierarchy. So similarly, Jay Haley perceived the therapist's role as intervening in the sequence so that it couldn't continue in the same pattern, and that had been playing out, and that was about the hierarchy as well. Lynn Hoffman observed that that there was a challenge in breaking these rigid cycles in families, and apart from direct advice or structured moves, proposed interventions that was about prescribing the symptom and rituals as alternatives of what to do in that too. And in post-Milan therapy, the sequence explores behaviour and the effects of the behaviour in others, the effects of behaviour on others, and it's the basis of exploratory work taken up around these interactions, around the intention of behaviour, the meaning construed in actions, and the responses to that become a central focus. And in post-Milan, it's through the release of new information into the family system that people adjust their thinking and respond to that. So across different models, one of the main ways sequences are used is in assessment information and as a source of this interactional data for the therapist. And the therapist gathers the information that either confirms or challenges their hypotheses, and subsequently uses that information to guide their next intervention with the client too. Which leads to the second point here, that often the purpose of gathering a sequence is to define a problem sequence, and the work is to replace it with an optimal sequence. And I think a good example of this, while it's not a family therapy model, is dialectical behaviour therapy, because it helpfully illustrates the use of a solution sequence in replacing a problem sequence. And the way DBT does this is a chain behaviour analysis is taken around a problem. It's a close tracking of precipitating factors and triggers that they talk about that might have contributed to the arousal of someone's nervous system and the subsequent behaviours that they've taken to try and calm themselves down and manage this. And the development and maintenance of problem behaviours are thought of basically as a lack of skills and capabilities in being able to manage them better. And so because that's seen as a deficit of skills, the work in DBT is the therapist's role in DBT is to have a solution analysis role. And part of that is teaching clients new skills or behaviors and actually replace the problem kind of sequence with a solution sequence of what they need to do differently, being instructed by the DBT modules as part of that. So it's just a good example. And there are other, it's not exactly the same, but there are other family therapy models that are built on the same premise. So for example, integrative family therapy fosters change through changing the sequences. It aims to define the sequences of interaction in which the problem is embedded, is how it would talk about it. It attempts to solve problems, drawing on a range of techniques by introducing a solution sequence that replaces part of or all of the problem sequence as well. And Carl Toms and his associates, their interpersonal patterns approach, which is called the IP scope, tracks what he calls pathologizing interpersonal patterns, so PIPs, and then the work in the course of therapy is to create alternative interactions in the form of what he calls well-being interpersonal patterns, WIPs, or healthy interpersonal patterns, HIPs. So this idea that the problem is being replaced by healthier or, what he calls kind of well-being patterns, and that's the purpose of the therapy and what the sequence is used for. So I think an approach to working with families from a Bowen Theory approach raises really important questions about who is taking responsibility for solving the dilemma that a family presents with, and that the effort is really about creating opportunities for the family to think and define their own dilemma and solve their own problems, rather than the therapist being the one doing this for them. And so I think actually that a different way of using sequences is to have this lens of the emotional system and the emotional stimuli that keeps driving that emotional system, and an effort to observe the emotional process that is driving the relationship interactions. And so I think this different way of using sequences is for the actual process of tracking the interaction to be the work in itself. And that work is about observing self in the context of interactions, and to begin to pay attention to the emotional process. So while the emotional process itself is invisible, the idea is that it can be inferred by the behaviors in the relationship and the reactions that occur to one another in that. So in this approach, the work of slowing down a sequence or interaction or getting factual about it, what a person says or doesn't say or does or doesn't do when they get stirred up, and seeing how others are affected by that and what they do to respond, and then how others respond to that in an ongoing way, that sort of observation is the main work. It's not a vehicle for assessment or diagnosis or defining a problem or to lead to other work afterwards. It's actually the observation of self is key to seeing oneself in the context of relationships, and making sense of that. So I think the key to people being able to get more thoughtful about what they think and how they act begins with this work of self-observation, and that it's the ongoing work as well. I don't think we ever kind of move on from that. And I think that sequences provide a way for people to get outside of their intensity a little bit, and observe themselves in their relationships. So the way I use sequences is to create the opportunity for clients to observe these, I guess what we'd say, the stimulus response mechanisms. That is, what are they hearing and seeing and reacting to? And what or who do they move towards or away from when they react? And what do they do? This is, I think, the emotional process that's occurring in response to the stimuli that people are picking up. And the effort for me in using sequences to do this is to help people define what they're doing in more detail, to be aware of that and to bring that into cognitive awareness. So partly this is about slowing down an interaction and really pulling it apart to define this in more detail. And what that allows in a session is for the therapist and client to be collaborative in this process, and for the coach, the clinician to be a researcher with the client. It tries to focus on functional facts occurring in the relationship, and it really invites the client to see their part in the patterns that are playing out. And the effort is to move towards the focus of seeing the emotional process and its effects and what people do themselves when they're stirred up, and to shift away from a blaming or cause and effect approach in the relationship. So really shifting from an individual focus to the relationship system as a focus, and see the bigger picture of that, with each person seeing their own part and contribution to that too. So Michael Kerr has this description just about, this kind of research position, I think. He says, cause and effect thinking asks why. Why does the other person treat me this way? Maybe this person has abandonment issues, commitment issues, bonding issues, or anger issues. Cause and effect thinking seeks the explanation for another's words and actions within that individual. In contrast, systems thinking does not ask why, it asks how, what, when, and where. Such questions enable tracking of the relationship interactional process, and by doing so, recognizing how each individual's attitudes, thoughts, feelings, and actions are in response to the process. Each individual helps create and maintain the process, but does not cause it. So the other aspect I'm interested in is the role of the coach in working alongside clients in this way. So, picking up on those descriptions from before, that my own efforts as a coach and as a clinician are to stay focused on the process, to not get caught up in the content, to focus on the chain reaction between clients, but to keep myself out of it, so that they can observe for themselves the ebb and flow of this process between them. And I just want to say, as a helper, a trained, well-meaning, well-intentioned family therapist, this is a constant effort to restrain my temptation at this point to keep making suggestions or promote a particular agenda or give some well-meaning advice or really help, direct people in what to pay attention to or what not. But this is why being anchored in theory is important to me, because knowing that my best efforts are directed to managing my own reactivity and staying curious with their own thinking and adopting a posture with them that really promotes their own capacity to observe and think and problem solve is important to me. And so actually for me, having a structured approach, I like using sequences, can help me with my own managing self as well and keeping myself out of things, because the effort is really to collaborate with the client on what they're thinking and hearing what they think is working and not working in these processes as we unpack an interaction together. And what I actually notice is that, in tapping into their thinking in this way, clients are able to observe more neutrally and see that there is the possibility of alternatives for them rather than what is just happening as they'd felt kind of more automatically or reactively. So, that's just another one from Kerr. So, I think the other thing is I don't like to just assume or jump to the idea that people are kind of moving towards differentiation in kind of doing this. But I do think it's really interesting that the effort is about having some more conscious control over the reactivity in these interactions, and that doing that more and more can add to or facilitate a step towards that. I'm interested in that theoretically. Okay, so I'm just going to spend this last part talking about, well, what does this actually look like in clinical practice, and share some examples with you. So I'm going to finish with some examples about my own efforts to take a systems-informed approach to using sequences in clinical practice, with this reminder that the goal is to define in more detail what each person is reacting to and to move towards observing the emotional process. And when I'm talking about tracking a sequence or interaction, I'm really talking about asking those research questions. So who, what, where, when, how, around a particular dilemma or a particular problem that the client has identified or come in with. So when I'm talking about this is what it kind of looks like. I use a format similar to this one. This is a series of questions in tracking an interaction or sequence that's actually used in the Parent Hope Project. And for those interested, actually, that's a parenting kind of program. And tracking interactions is a key feature of each of those sessions as part of that process too, as a way for parents to be observing themselves in their interactions with their young people. So when I'm tracking an interaction, I start with the details about where and when the interaction took place, who was there, who wasn't there. It follows details about how the interaction started, and uses questions to inquire about how each person responded to the other and what they did in reaction to the other person. It also asks about the emotional tone for each person. So this is about observing physiological indicators that change and shift during the interaction, as well as it might be a language around feelings as well. And then it's really repeated questions of what happened next and how was that responded to, and then what happened over there in bold on the right-hand side, until the interaction is exhausted or finished. And the interaction finishes when it's been exhausted and almost as though it could start off again. So importantly, one of the things I do is ask at the end in going through this, how similar this interaction is to other interactions that clients have had, from rare, like this might be a really extreme example or a one-off situation, through to this happens all the time. This is really familiar. And most of the time, it's interesting, most clients would say the things that they're bringing up are pretty familiar. They're happening kind of 4 to 5. They're familiar to them. So just, if it's of interest to people, some more about the setup of this, it is my preference to track this on a whiteboard with people. I think the visual stimuli and the focus helps. And so my preference is to use either a physical whiteboard in the room or to use an online whiteboard like Freeform, and to track it in a circular notion, because I think that helps in kind of thinking about the cyclical nature of this. And I think the other thing to say is that I really try and use the words and language that clients bring to these descriptions rather than putting my own language up there or any of clinical interpretations, because I think that's an important part of the client being an expert in the process. I do this work with individuals or couples or one or both parents together, and have also on occasion done it with parents and teens in the room together as well, if they're both interested in doing the work. Because the goal is for each person to observe themselves, it doesn't really matter if it's one person or multiple people in the room. So mostly what I do actually when I do it is to track the outside first, the black bits, and I'll track through the behaviors and the movements of people first. And then what I will do is I'll come back through and we'll map the emotional tone alongside that, almost like a different parallel train track going with that. And this is shaped by my thinking about how invisible that emotional process can be, but that it shows up in how people react and what they do. And I find breaking it apart like this helps to observe more subtle shifts in the emotional tone and people's arousal and what they're noticing about themselves, to really pay attention to that as we go on. I think also what I have found helpful in doing it this way is that it also gives opportunity for the clients to reflect on what is actually familiar with them about the interaction, because it's not often the specifics of the behaviors in the black bits or the kind of, where they were and what happened that is familiar to them, although sometimes it can be, but it's the emotional process of the inside, the emotional tone and the shifts and the reactivity that can feel like a really familiar story for people. And so actually being able to separate that and see that differently is one of the ways to pay attention to that in a unique way. So it's almost like you can keep that inside track and you could replace the outside with all sorts of different places, or scenarios, but the emotional process of the inside pattern is the thing that plays out again and again in relationships. So just as an example of this, so this is an example of if I do it on Freeform, if I've got a Zoom session or a telehealth session, so this kind of tracking the behaviors and the black in the outside, but we'll go back through and map the emotional tone, feelings, kind of physiological kind of awareness on the inside of that as well. And this is what it looks like on a whiteboard, very messy, hard to read the writing, but it's moving quickly. And again, have got that kind of black kind of in terms of what happened and who was where and who was doing what, and have gone back through with the client and kind of mapped in a different color the emotional tone and the processes and what they're noticing about themselves and any feelings that they use to describe that too. So this one is a neater version of that one with the black and the red. And I'll just give you an example of this so you get an idea of, separating these things out. So this is a client who has an older teenage daughter who has mental health concerns. I've just been working with the mother. She describes this interaction or this sequence of stuff that happens where the daughter's gone away with her boyfriend and his family for the weekend. She rings the mum up here. She's in tears. She says, "I'm hungry and I'm tired. I have no money, but I really need some food." So the mum's, 300 kilometers away. She's worried about her daughter's safety and she kind of jumps into action. She tries to contact the boyfriend's mother, but there's no answer. The mum describes herself as kind of stewing and trying to center herself. She knows enough about trying to regulate herself that she's trying to do that in the middle of this. She starts to collect evidence that the daughter is physically safe via some contact on the phone. She sends the daughter a message every half an hour and the daughter responds. 2 hours later, the daughter has eaten and is in company again and is settled. And this is the mum's description. "Everything was fine, but not for me." The daughter comes back Sunday evening. I felt torn between shaking her and hugging her. They hug. It's not talked about. She says, I didn't want it to blow up again. So when I went back through with this client and mapped kind of the emotional tone or what was kind of happening at that level, you get these descriptions of the mum feeling really helpless. The daughter is upset and distressed, a bit paranoid, and the mum's far away and feeling quite anxious. And she says, I have an urge to take control. Her anxiety is increasing. As it shifts and the daughter becomes fine, the daughter's not worried anymore, but the mum's anxiety is still really high. And she says what happens for her next is that she gets increasingly frustrated and she starts to feel resentful. When her daughter comes back, she's relieved and angry, and she's left with this emotional residue, like she's still really frustrated. And her description is, but I know to leave it. Now, I think this is an example of, you know, what do we do kind of after we kind of track this information? And my effort in the kind of bit afterwards is to really sit back with a client and invite their own observations and their own thinking and what stands out to them when they see it mapped out like this. And this mother, for example, picked up or kind of talked about these sorts of things. She says, look, I had a really strong emotional response, but it was to a real need. Like she had some needs and I had this kind of strong response to that. She noticed that her jumping into action made her feel like she, you know, could be in control, and that she said, this is what I do. I think I do that as a way to kind of manage things when I get anxious. It was a really kind of standout point to her that she said everything was fine for her daughter, but actually not for her. And that strong emotional kind of tone remained for her. And she observed that this is the cycle. You know, that's my word, emotional distance there, but that distance is used to manage that intensity. It's not talked about until it happens again. And so that's kind of part of what she noticed. So these are the sorts of questions that I might use to invite someone's thinking. You know, what do they think they're doing that's working or not working here? What do they notice about what they do more of or less of when things are heating up and get more intense? What do they pick up from others that stirs them up and they get reactive to? What do they notice about their own physiology when it's aroused or heightened, or also when it calms down as well? And I think the thing I'm always reminded of when I am able to stay out of the process enough and invite the thinking and kind of do this collaboratively is that clients have a really good idea for themselves about what is working and not working. And that when they're given a calm enough space to slow down and unpack it and think about it, actually the things that they notice about these interactions are exactly the sorts of things that I notice about them too. Now, I might have a lot of therapy jargon that I could throw at it and descriptions and other thinking as well, but it's really important for me to stay with what the clients are observing as they define these dilemmas and observe themselves in it as well. So, yeah, I think it's really important at this process, at this pointy end of it, to really be managing myself. So either not kind of cheering a client on or adding other things that I think they should be noticing or paying attention to, but to keep using this evidence to stay curious with them too. And just to keep asking those questions and asking those questions that might not easily be answered either in a session. And I come back to kind of what Bowen says at one point about the therapist is always interested in who has been thinking, how much he has thought, what was the pattern of the thoughts, and what kind of working conclusions came from the thinking. The therapist implies with questions that it is the family's problem to solve. He asks if they've made progress, what is blocking their progress, if they have any ideas about how to get past the block, or if they have any plans to speed up progress, and any other, many other questions of this nature. So, I think one of the efforts in this kind of unpacking it in quite a lot of detail is to describe and kind of define the stimuli more specifically and in more detail. Because I really think that if people are able to define the dilemmas that they have more accurately, they're more equipped to actually do something about it. So there's a really interesting description in family therapy and clinical practice in the work with a couple around a conflict that was kind of stimulated in between this couple, and that actually a breakthrough came with this couple when the male in the couple was able to identify it was a particular look that the wife had in her eyes that really stirred him up, and that the effort in kind of doing something differently was actually for him to reduce his looking at her or the exposure to the stimuli in that. But that she also had some control in hearing this and getting aware of this in kind of what looks she was giving in this process too. So it's just an interesting example. What interests me is that the control is a conscious decision to do something differently, and that the minute detail can be a part of that. And that the decision in that one, for example, was about reducing the amount or the exposure to stimuli, which can help someone stay in control of themselves or manage themselves in that. So just, I've just put a list up here with some of the descriptions that I came across in preparing for this around the details of what we might say, the minor appearing stimuli that are in there. So these ideas, mannerisms, gestures, tones of voice, we get these sorts of descriptions, that look of hatred in her eyes, that icy cold stare, that tone of voice, that sneer of contempt, feelings of revulsion in response to habits and mannerisms. In the other, reactions in which one's flesh crawls. I think that sounds a bit like a horror movie. There's jarring emotional responses to sensory stimuli. There's a description of a strong sexual attraction, a real arousal, a sexual arousal there, a look of helplessness on a husband's face. And this description, a glum look, which raises tension in the other and is reflected in an octave or two increase in the verbal response. So just what is being seen and heard in these kind of relationship interactions with people, remembering that there's hundreds and maybe thousands of these happening. So just an example of what, like the level of detail that, sometimes I get to with people as I do this. This is working with a male partner of a couple who have been in conflict, and really kind of getting to this detail around what did he notice? What did he pay attention to? He could describe, when he was able to slow it down enough, facial expressions that he noticed, a questioning look he described, an annoyance, that this worry that she might turn away from the conversation, with a physical turning away. He talked about her eyes go narrow. She does a thing with her mouth. Her mouth is agape. She looks at her phone. And what does he notice about himself? He notices that he has a fear or anticipation of it going badly. And that in reaction to this, he really moves into problem solving. And he noticed himself kind of how he moved in that. He sat upright more. He really kind of winds up, was his description. And this idea that I need to focus on this more, kind of hypervigilance to it in response to these kind of minor stimuli that were happening in the relationship. So I just want to finish with two examples, very conscious of time. Two examples that I think illustrate some guiding principles I have in family therapy. So one of my principles is informed by theory, really, that I want the family to know itself well enough that it can adjust itself to stressors without the help of an external service. And one of the things I find in tracking sequences with the same family is that they do become experts in what's happening and almost anticipate what's happening. And they get creative in their problem solving as part of that too. The goal is not for me to solve their problems, but to increase their resourcefulness within the family. So this example, I won't go through all of these in detail, but there's a sequence of 4 with these, with this same family. And this is a mother in which there was a lot of conflict with the husband and the daughter. The daughter was quite depressed, really struggling to engage in school. And what was really interesting in the series of doing these sequences is that the mother's observations really early on in these sequences was that things were really tense, but nothing was happening, despite a lot of emotional energy going into things. She said, I'm frustrated. I get frustrated. She gets frustrated. Nothing happens. No one gets anything. Over time, she starts to really kind of try and work on her own being calm. This is the mum kind of trying to wind herself back a little bit. And she says kind of during the course of this that she started to get a little bit more hopeful. She said, I was in control of myself. And actually one of the things was that the daughter, and she started to be able to have some conversations about what was happening rather than what was happening before, with the daughters kind of shutting down or distancing. And the mum felt like that was more collaborative. And then this last one, the mum actually thought she'd been helpful in this. There was a bit more flexibility and there was a more open and honest conversation happening between them. And I use this example because actually the problem didn't get solved. Like the daughter was still depressed and the, school continued to be a struggle. But the shift that I saw in this family was that the mother became a different resource to the young person in this process. And I think that creating resources and opening that up in a family system is really important and part of the goal of the work. Now, lastly, what I'm going to do is just share a brief video, it's about 3 minutes long, with a parent I worked with. Now, this is about kind of 6 months after I worked with her. And I share this video because I think the other bit that is important to me is that I think with enough observation of self and people accessing their thinking, people really can create the capacity to choose to do something differently. And I think this mother's description is a really interesting description of that. So I'll just play this and then I will wrap up.
Look, I can honestly and genuinely say that whole whiteboard process of mapping out a situation, that has really, I map that out in my head all the time, and I actually physically have a representation in my mind of the whiteboard, and I talk about to myself, all right, well, if I respond one way, where is this going to escalate to? And if I also have to think is how important is it to me as well, and I think that's one of the biggest things is how important is me being right about this, and going from there. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I took away from it is the fact that I can think through a situation as it's happening. I don't have to wait till the end to then think through and decide what went wrong. Using the techniques to think on the spot in some really, really difficult situations at times. Sometimes it can be life and death situations that you've got to stop and think. So I think the simplicity of the analogy of it, of sitting, we sat and did the whiteboard. But the simplicity of the actual process made it easy enough to ingrain it in my own mind to be able to reuse it over and over. And I think, that was really powerful for me.
And I would remember sometimes that as you would talk about things, you would do this with your hands. Because
I did it just then, didn't I? I do, because I actually see, I physically see it in my head. Yeah. So rather than just talking about it, I'm a very visual person anyway, but rather than just talking about it, having that, that
in your mind.
Visual representation in my mind has really been helpful.
Which leads me to ask about one of the examples that stands out in my mind from our work together, which was, I remember you were saying, it was maybe our second session together, and you were in the hospital, and you said you were in the middle of a crisis, and you saw the whiteboard in your mind.
I did.
Can you take me through that a little bit and what went on for you in that process?
Sure. So my daughter had been making some really bad choices and had been not looking after herself. She has both mental and physical disabilities. So she'd been making some terrible choices and had been leaning very heavily on her boyfriend rather than me. And that was obviously quite hurtful for me that I wasn't getting to be as involved as I felt that I should have been. Anyway, we were at the hospital, and in the hospital, and I was trying to talk to her about some of the consequences of her actions, and of course being a mum, but and I just basically got told to shut up and mind my own business, and I wasn't allowed to take the usual photo I always took with these, you know, we had all these photos, so I wasn't allowed to do any of those things. Anyway, I sat there and I went, you know, it was on the tip of my tongue to really tell her what I thought of her behaviours at that moment. And I did. The whiteboard popped up in my head, and it literally, I went, okay, well, where are we on the cycle right now? We've been through this before. We know exactly where it's going. Where am I on the cycle? Is it too late to stop it? And I realised that it was not too late to stop it. It went against my grain. Like I really felt that she was doing me wrong. But then I stopped and I looked at the whiteboard and I went, okay, well, if I disengage in this confrontation now, it can't escalate. It's got nowhere to go if I disengage. Whereas if I continue to engage, it's going to get bigger and bigger. And none of us need that right now. We're in the hospital. So anyway, that was where I was able to then disengage at that point, and it worked. It didn't escalate. There was nowhere for it to go. Yeah,
it's an amazing example of how
a really interesting description, I think, of someone able to see the cycle and be familiar with it enough to interrupt it herself when it was happening kind of in her own life and in a situation with her daughter. Now, I'm just going to finish with this. I'm a mother of a teenage daughter, and I want to just take a line from Taylor Swift here at this point, who sings this line. She says, I think I've seen this film before and I didn't like the ending. And when I hear that mother talk, that's the sort of thing that I think is going on there. You know, I think this is about the effort to do something differently and what it can look like. You know, I've seen this, I felt this before, I didn't like where it went last time. And with the engagement of the thinking system, you know, what can I actually do differently so that it doesn't head in that same direction as well. All right, I'm going to finish there. That's so much talking from me, and I'm so happy to stop. All right, back to you, Kathleen.
All right, thank you, Lauren. So if folks have questions or thoughts, please use the raised hand button at your toolbar, and I will call on you. Just for the sake of time, if folks can just have one question versus several, that is appreciated. All right. Kay.
Thanks. Thanks, Lauren. That's so helpful. I just wondered if you have some tips about if you're working on a sequence, you're putting it out there, maybe you've got a couple or a dyad in the room, and they just kind of keep insisting on the cause and effect, blaming sort of, like, do you have ideas for redirecting that to more the who, what, when, where, like those things you said?
Yeah, it's a great question because, I mean, everyone loves a tangent, don't they? And then like they want to dig up stories from 5 years ago, whatever else it is. I actually find that's where the structure helps me, because if I'm pen on the wall saying, okay, and then actually what happened next in this interaction? I'm sure there's loads of other things that have gone on. Like, let's just stay focused on this one, you know? Sometimes what I will do, because people can even get really kind of into the nitty gritty about facts, sometimes what I will do is do it like a double train line. He said this happened, she said this happened, now we're back to kind of agreeing on what happened next. You know, like I don't want to get caught up in the content so much that it derails the process. So, but that's where I find the structure helps me too, because I'm able to say, okay, back to this. Like this is, yeah.
No, good point. Not allowing yourself to be caught.
That's such an effort, you know, but it's that's part of my work, I think, in this process. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Charlie White.
Hi, Lauren. How you doing?
Good.
So this is, I mean, seeing the spirals and so forth reminds me, of course, of Ginny Brown's work with the PHP and all that. And I was just wondering, so I just went through PHP training in New Jersey with her for a few days, and as someone who got first exposed to Bowen theory back in the early 1990s and basically did the kind of organic working on yourself, differentiation of self, and the techniques emerged from within, that sort of thing, and been doing that for 30 years, and then being exposed to Jenny and her program, which is sort of like a structure, that kind of
Yeah.
comes down. And it's just sort of interesting. I'm just wondering, kind of a more macro discussion here, or I'd like to hear your thoughts about. Well, first of all, I missed a very few minutes of the beginning here. I don't know if you talked a little bit about your journey with the theory and journey with working on differentiation of self, blah blah blah, and how. And I don't know if you had a period where you kind of were doing what I described before you got exposed to a structure, if you will, or did those things happen simultaneously, or what? And then, of course, the question here is, what do you see as kind of the interplay between those two, and the advantages and the disadvantages of having a structure versus having something that maybe is organic, that comes more from you specifically?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charles, and I think it is a real question around how do we think about technique in Bowen theory. I think I often hold in mind the kind of flow between theory and method and technique, and I guess what I'm doing here with sequences is working backwards from some of my family therapy training and testing it out from a Bowen theory approach, and I think there's lots of things in my original family therapy training that I wouldn't use because it doesn't fit for me from a Bowen theory informed approach. But I think the reality is everyone who's sitting in a room with a client is using some kind of technique. And I think the purpose for me is to be as theory informed as I can about what I'm actually doing in my efforts in the room with people too. I also work with a lot of young clinicians, at the FSI. I do supervision of young clinicians in mental health spaces, and they're sitting with families in a room and they want to know what to do, and that's not just to say, okay, well, here's loads of techniques, just pick your own and that sort of thing. But I do actually think a little bit of systems thinking for people in those situations is better than none at all. But for me, it is really testing these things out, so it's a great question. And I mean, I don't use this in isolation. I'm not talking about my broader practice. I use family diagrams, I use timelines, I get my own coaching, constantly working on managing myself, there's all those sorts of things kind of happening as well. I think it's really up to each clinician to test this out for themselves. What is helpful about it and what's not helpful about it. For me, I have found this approach as a way to get myself out of it in some ways and to really promote clients' own observing of themselves and taking up the problem for themselves. That might not be the case for everyone, so that's, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know. It opens up a really big, broad discussion around the role of technique. But for me, it's really, I think everyone in the room is doing something, and I just want to reiterate, for me, it's just really important that I keep testing that out for myself with the theory and my own principles of practice that are important to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I make one last statement on this? I think it's interesting. I think the organic approach of, grounding oneself in the theory, working on differentiation of self and so forth, while that is, certain, of course, technique kind of rises from within. There's a lot to be said for that. However, I think you can also, over time, reinforce your blind spots through that, because you'll sidestep the things inadvertently. You'll sidestep the things that are maybe challenging to your most your underbelly, if you will, the most sensitive part of yourself. As much as we like to say we're all working on our differentiation of self with authenticity and rigor and so forth, we're human, okay? And so we're going to sidestep things. I think one of the things I like about being exposed to Jenny's program and the PHP, being that it's more of a reverse engineering top down, is that I actually found it exposed some of my blind spots by taking on a structure. It was like, oh, this is interesting. This is something I would not do normally in my organic approach to doing Bowen coaching. And this technique, if you will, or this structure is forcing me to do something that comes really unnatural to me. And that's a good thing, and then it's like, wow, that is actually helping me identify a blind spot of mine that I would not have identified had I not done PHP. So anyway, I just think there's something to be said for engineering and then reverse engineering in terms of being able to diminish one's blind spot over time. So
Yep, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Right.
That's part of that. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's interesting. Thanks.
All right, we had somebody and they disappeared, so I don't know where Daniel went. Anybody else have a question or comment for Lauren? I had a thought of like, oh no, I thought somebody went up. I had a thought of like, there's so many ways to be creative with this, and like you could just have people read their text messages at the end of the week out loud, writing is another sequence, right?
Yeah.
And how much emotional process do you see in that, right? Like if you had a couple who they had to do that every week, I think they'd learn a lot about themselves, right? And I think, right? And I think about like, for me, it's what you described, Lauren, is sort of a process of giving people a research question and how having this it stimulates curiosity. What that woman described in the video of, I wonder if it's too late to stop to stop this, to slow this down, right? And that, to me, that's the shift. Is the cause and effect thinking versus now I have a research question that I can test out and see if it's true or not. If I get off the ride at this point in the sequence, does it make a difference? Maybe not, but I think that shifts how people think about the problem versus just kind of the blame stuff. So yeah, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think that, the difference between Bowen theory in family therapy practice and other family therapy models is go and do the work in your own relationships. Like you can do the thinking here, but go and do it elsewhere. Like this is not, or the session facilitates the thinking and the questions and the curiosities, but you've got to go and live your own life and kind of test this out next. And what works and what doesn't, I think, are really core questions in that too. The session is a vehicle to that, but it's not the be all and end all as part of that, and wants to get out of the way, I guess, in some ways too. Yeah.
True. All right, Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It was very relatable for me because I'm very concrete. I actually am sometimes told I'm formulaic, and it's not said in a flattering way. And yet, I think my desire for concreteness has given me a lens that does help my clients that like something concrete. And I use the metaphor of a Mad Lib. Do you have those where you live? When we were kids, they were little one-page scripts, and it would be a different theme, and the sentence would have blanks, and under the blank it would say adjective or noun, and then you would fill it in. Of course, when we were kids, we would say silly things and all giggle. But I've thought for years now of writing a book, My Life in a Mad Lib, and I've shared this with clients that there's probably some human themes that we could just keep lifting the page and writing in our own details, who it was, what happened. And through that lens, I think it enables people to step away from the intimate emotion, which is what your design, I think did. And I'm really going to try it. I think it's inspiring. I really like it. I like it. And I've done what that woman said because I've had that thought, oh, I know where this is going because I've been in this Mad Lib 5 times now, or I've seen it. And I find it very helpful. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Laura. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question or thought for Lauren. Unless people are too sleepy to.
Not me.
All right. Well, if we don't have anybody else, thank you so much for your presentation and your thinking. Just some upcoming things at the Bowen Center I want to highlight for folks. We have a clinical conference with Reverend Jennifer Long tomorrow, if you aren't aware of that. And then obviously our spring conference on April 25th and 26th with Dr. Joan Roughgarden, the Human Family and Sexual Diversity and the Human Family, a Bowen Theory Perspective is the title. And Dr. Roughgarden there will be a viewing of part of the documentary that she's helped create. And so that won't be available after the event. So if people are interested in that, I'd encourage you to check it out. But yeah, thank you so much, Lauren, again, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good one.